Hello. Today I want to talk about Confucius. Confucius, the canonical symbolic Chinese philosopher, the one who most people in most places around the world anyway, if you said who is a classical Chinese philosopher, they would say Confucius. Confucius, also the kind of avatar of the wise Asian man. Confucius say, and then you get this motto and his wisdom and so on. So an extremely important character, Confucius, and someone clearly who's going to be important to understand if we're interested in classical China. He's sort of, as I say, sort of the avatar of classical China. Really, what I want to do today is just three very basic things by way of introducing Confucius. I want to talk about first, I would use the word what. What is Confucius? Is Confucius a religious figure? If he's a philosophical figure, what kind of philosophical figure? So I want to be specific, and I am opinionated as to exactly what Confucius is, what his project is, the kind of thinker he is. And then after we talk about that a little, obviously the thing is to talk about what it is that Confucius said. What is Confucius's message? What's the basic takeaway from the thought of Confucius? And in his case, I think we can do that in a useful and coherent and at the same time valid way. And then obviously, the last thing to consider in terms of takeaways from today's video about Confucius is how does understanding Confucius, how does having a basic introduction to Confucius help us understand Chinese thought in general, and specifically what sorts of Chinese thought. All right, so let me put this up now. As I say, Confucius, I guess I just told you everything I wanted to tell you while I had my Confucius slide up. We'll go back to the Confucius slide. Confucius, let me just say something about the image. Confucius is, again, very iconic, always portrayed in the same sort of way. There are a couple of these figures. Bodhidharma is another one. Bodhidharma is the very angry looking sort of wild man that you'll see in classical Chinese landscape painting and other places. And we'll talk about Bodhidharma later. He's important for Buddhism. Confucius always represented in this kind of way as a sage. And so one of the things we want to talk about is sort of what a sage is. Is a sage a religious leader, a philosopher, or what? Okay. I do think that in the case of Confucius, his biography is very important. It looks to me, as in the case of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, it looks like Confucius's childhood and his experience of youth was something that was very important in terms of shaping his thinking and his priorities. He lost his father at a young age when he was a toddler, in a society where not having a father was, a serious matter, and he was very poor. His mother died when he was fairly young as well, right about when he was coming into adulthood. And Confucius, from humble origins, married very young, had two children young. I mean, nowadays we would think it was very young. So a young man with a hard scrabble life. But in the case of Confucius, he had a kind of insight when he was 15 years old that he saw, and this is important to his thinking, that he understood that if he devoted himself to studying, if he devoted himself to studying the classics, to studying the sages, to studying the Proverbs, to studying the I Ching, that that was the route, that was the way that he could make something of himself. And he discovered in doing that, I think, just how right he was. And in fact, I think the essence of Confucius is that he links education with really kind of flowering into personhood in a very real way. Okay, and he also then, as a matter of policy, also subsequently thought that public education was absolutely critical. He's very similar to Plato in some of these sort of social engineering ways, and that's not coincidental. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And he was an able person. He was a smart young man. He did come from a noble lineage, just an impoverished, side branch of a noble lineage. And above all, Confucius used to talk about trustworthiness. He said, in politics particularly, and Confucius did live an itinerant life for a number of years as a kind of freelance advisor to courts and sort of traveling from court to court. It's the same thing, by the way, that Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, used to do, also going and talking to rulers and talking to people who had something to say about organizing society. And Confucius did that for a while before returning to Lu, where he came from. But he always said for that kind of work, political advising, diplomatic work, the key was trustworthiness. He said any you could have any other kinds of good qualities, but it had to be that you were trustworthy. And again, the thing about Confucius is really seamless. When he says trustworthy, you trust somebody to be what they are. If you know what they are, you can trust that and you know what that means, then that's what you can trust, right? Trust is a matter of understanding certain facts about a person, really. And so, and for Confucius, it's all about sort of building a person. And again, this is another way that his teachings are definitely reminiscent, for example, of the first half of Plato's Republic, where there's a great deal of attention to the education of a proper citizen. And Confucius is all about that as well. Not coincidentally, as I say, since they're both in the middle of the first millennium, actually, both born in the, Confucius is born in the 6th century probably, and Plato in the 5th, and Socrates. In any event, so he became successful. He became an important advisor. Notably, people trusted him to administer their estates. He was very close to these very sort of upper class people because he kind of saw upper class people as, like Aristotle did, as kind of good representatives and good products of the civilization. A very conservative thinker, by the way, we have here, as we do with the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, I think. He is importantly placed historically. The Warring State period is coming to an end. You're going to get unification under Emperor Qi in around the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 2nd century BCE. And that's when you get this Qi dynasty, a short-lived dynasty, but the dynasty that really unified the central states, the Middle Kingdom of China. And Confucius was on hand for that. He was a witness to that. And he actually rose pretty far. At one time, he almost had 3 cities talked into tearing down their city walls. This became a very important issue about what people were going to do with their fortifications. And that was because Confucius advocated that everyone needed to take their fortifications down. But he wasn't successful in this. Like Plato, Confucius found rulers who he thought he might advise. He ultimately never did manage to get anyone to institute the sort of ideal programs that he had. Later on, subsequently, that he became legendary in the Han Dynasty, these very civilizing, culture-building dynasty that lasted for 400 years that followed Emperor Qi's 30-year reign. Okay, now, just quickly, if we're studying the ancient times, studying Bronze Age Mesopotamia, studying the ancient Egyptians, studying the ancient Hindus, ancient Greeks, even the New World stuff, the Mayan stuff, the Aztec stuff, it's all about the bibliography. It's all about the texts and other sort of interpretable artifacts that we have. Knowing when the texts emerged, something about their provenance. When you're back in the 2nd or 3rd millennium BCE, that tends to be pretty much what you've got, because the presence of the texts is the presence that's recorded. And so Confucius, very much aware of that, and Confucius, during the Warring States period, thinking, well, there was a time in the past when there was more unity, and so he drew back onto ancient cultural sources. He thought these were tremendously important. Again, he's all about your personal identity and your cultural identity are really basically the same thing, and you're really not even going to be there sort of if you don't have this cultural identity. So he was hot for culture. They were always, he and his followers always gathering things, editing things, publishing things. Uh, Notably, the five classics. There was a sixth classic on music, by the way. Again, like Plato and Socrates, Confucius thinks that music is directly influences the body, and that the rhythms and intonations of music are extremely important in terms of influencing a person's character. So there was apparently a treatise of music, the so-called sixth classic, that was lost. You have a big compilation of folkloric poetry. Sometimes people think the Confucians and the Taoists are at odds with each other politically, I suppose. From time to time, you can find places where they are, but philosophically, not really, because Confucius isn't really offering any kind of alternative cosmology. In fact, he's quite consistent with the Tao Te Ching. So you have a lot of poetry and a lot of historical material about three different sort of annals written by ancient historians. And then you have the I Ching. The I Ching that in this period is treated as a kind of cosmological document. The I Ching, from time to time, of course, it's a divination vehicle. It's a religious document. It's a psychological document. During the Han period, it was really taken seriously as a kind of philosophical and cosmological. The Book of Rites is important. Remember, with the Vedas, the Hindu Vedas, one of the four sections of each Vedic poem is a ritual and ceremony section. These are very important to us now, not because they say put the candle here or do this or that, but rather because they give us explanations and rationalizations as to why they're doing what they're doing, like the ancient Egyptians do in their tombs. And so this tells us a whole lot about their cosmology, their astronomy, their philosophy, their society, their ethical codes, and all kinds of other things. So these ritual books are important. And then we'll see with Confucius that the whole idea of ritual is actually systematically very important to Confucius as well. And there are also Confucian texts written at the time, apparently by Confucius and his followers, more books of rites, commentaries on chapters from the Book of Rites, and the Analects. Most people, if you mention Confucius, they'll say, well, the basic publication is the Analects. Call the Analects much later. It's the version of an anthology of allegedly Confucian sayings that comes down to us from around this time, from around maybe the originally compiled in the 5th century BCE. But it's a text that's been through a lot. It's considered a somewhat latter-day text. And then Mencius, after, put it this way, Confucius and Lao Tse, maybe the two biggest sort of spiritual figures, if you will, roughly speaking, of ancient China, but Confucius and Mencius, the two secular philosophers of ancient China, which is more accurate, by the way. And we'll have a video on Mencius. These, as I say, at the time were not quite as appreciated as they might have been. Of course, Confucius himself and his followers were involved in all sorts of political things at the time, so that probably colored people's perceptions and opinions of them. But a few hundred years later, by a couple of hundred years later, the import of Confucian thinking on Chinese society had sort of started to sink in and be appreciated. And the Han Dynasty, around the year 140 BCE, or the second century of the second to last century of the first millennium, actually codified Confucianism as official state ideology, doctrine, not religion. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. Of course, he's been through a lot. I mean, the basic thing about Confucius, and I think this is true about any sort of conservative figure who wants to draw on sort of the past and have a really solid basis. This is a big problem for Aristotle. Confucius, I think, has exactly the same problem Aristotle has here in his Aristotle's Politics. That is, he tends to take the feudalistic structure of the Chinese nation with large landowners and nobility and kings and so on as sort of the natural expression of things, the way things have always been, the way that the sort of cosmic power of the universe has kind of arranged them. And he thinks his job is to sort of understand these things, describe and explain these structures. At least that's an uncharitable way of painting him as an unreconstructed conservative. Because negatively then, as it says there on the first bullet point, he seems to be, as Aristotle does, kind of justifying the status quo all the time with his approach to things, his kind of sort of scientific approach to things. Emperor Qi suppressed the Confucians for just this reason, the same reason that the Communist Party didn't like Confucius later on, that he was a sort of bourgeois roader who defended the upper classes. But the Han Dynasty, this 200-year dynasty of cultural flourishing that followed the unification of the warring states at the end of the third and beginning of the second century BCE, they understood, they saw how important Confucius could be. And so around 135, 140 BCE, they made Confucianism the state ideology. And they also at that time formed a bureaucracy. A meritocracy was, as it was conceived, where you had to study and pass these civil service exams again into the civil service. Nothing much has changed in China over the centuries, by the way. I mean, you're looking at the same political culture when you look at China today as we're looking at right now from 2,000 years ago. As I say, during the revolutionary period, Mao was ferociously anti-Confucian because he thought that Confucian was, again, a bourgeois apologist, and Confucian temples and so on were severely persecuted and razed and destroyed during this time. Nowadays, with respectable Communist Party China, you have Confucius as a tourist draw, and Confucius, of course, emphasizes loyalty and collective identity and other things that the Chinese Communist Party, just like all Chinese of all time, like. And so Confucius is in good repute in China today. All right, so then let's get down to some more substantial stuff then. First of all, what is he? Is he a religious figure? I would say no. He comes to us from a time, the first millennium BCE, when there wasn't a lot of daylight between religious figures and political leaders and intellectuals and ancestors. He was treated, certainly after he was codified by the Han Dynasty, treated as a semi-deity, a Taoist folk deity. And as I say, he actually is in line with Taoist thinking about being in touch with the cycles of nature and the rhythms of nature and so on. He's not antagonistic to that. However, what Confucius is a social theorist. He's a social theorist like Thomas Hobbes or Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Plato and Aristotle, to the extent that they are. That's what he does. He gives us a social theory, a theory essentially that talks about the individual coming subsequently to and being dependent on the collective and not the other way around. I think empirically that's an intuitively persuasive point, although I'm not here to make a political stand one way or the other. I'm just talking about social and political theory. All right, so like political theorists in general, like Thomas Hobbes, for example, during the War of the Roses, John Locke during the Restoration period, he lived during a time of civil war, the warring states, in fact, and so he was terribly concerned with doing something about this. He was writing from a place, as I say there on that third bullet point, of great urgency. Unlike many other social theorists, Plato and Rousseau notably, I would say, he was very concerned about the influence of society on the individual. This environmental influence of the society was either going to ruin the individual or make them a good person. And Confucius very much thinking that. So the most philosophically interesting aspects of Confucius then are going to be his discussion of the relationship between the individual and the society. And that also, of course, is where we see the essence of a sort of social theoretical difference between the East and the West. I don't want to push that too hard. I mean, you can be really reductive about that, but there clearly is a lot of substance to that. I mean, all stereotypes have some truth in them, and that's what we're looking at, I think, when we look at Confucius. So liberal social theory, European social theory, is sort of social contract theory, right? And so the idea is the obviously figurative image is the people all sort of getting together and agreeing to live under government because each one of them is a self-interested person. As I say, it looks to me like, as an empirical matter in terms of looking at actual sort of anthropological history, it seems clear enough that human beings are social animals, that they were in groups before they were humans, before they were Homo sapiens. They were already living in groups and living in collectives. So I think that's a sort of an interesting, at least, what is it? It's an interesting point to be interrogated about modern liberal democratic political theory. And of course, Plato raises the question notoriously about whether or not people really are equal in the ways in which they're equal. Confucius, I think, a little bit less totalitarian about that than Plato, maybe. I like Plato, by the way, don't get me wrong. What is the same between the Greeks and the Chinese here is organic social theory versus social contract social theory. Organic social theory, as I've just been saying, this is the third bullet point on the slide there, that human beings are group animals. They live in collectives. So what you're talking about is the collective. And not only that, but the collective is prior to the individual. So if you want to understand the individual, you have to understand the collective. And another way of looking at that, or a consequence of that way of looking at things, is virtue theory. So these thinkers, these classical mid-millennial thinkers, Confucius among them, tend to think in terms of what are the virtues of a good citizen and what are the good virtues of a good polity, a good society. Okay. So then ritual. Ritual is extremely important for Confucius. Remember, as a very young man, 15 years old, Confucius decided it's learning about the past, it's becoming educated about society. That is how I will sort of emancipate myself and protect myself and become someone. And so he concentrated very hard on the ancient things. He thought, he understood from the very beginning that that real identity is somehow collective, and that people should go to that. I'm going to, if you think about freedom, there's an interesting take on freedom here as well, that in order to be free, you have to be somebody, right? I mean, freedom is not something floating around. Freedom is a property that something has. What has freedom? Well, a person is either free or not. So you have to be a person, right? So freedom depends on a bunch of concreticity. The concreticity of the identity, according to Confucius, comes from the society. So rituals. The invisible becomes visible. I like that phrase. That's something that Confucius said about rituals, that in the ritual, the cosmic order, the Tain, as they call it, becomes visible. Okay, let me just step out of this for just a second. Okay. The ritual is showing how we are part of a larger cosmic order. We are part of a larger situation, such that we each have a real status. I mean, again, being someone is being part of this cosmic order. It's a kind of natural law theory. The leader is legitimate in as much as the leader is in touch with the rhythms of nature, the larger cosmic forces that are at work. So it's a humility, it's a spirituality that's kind of built into the thinking of the leader. Of course, in Confucius, part of that humility and spirituality comes from the leader's perception, just as everyone else, that the leader isn't the leader without without the collective, that the leader too depends on the well-being of the collective. And practicing this ritual then develops the virtues. The Confucians talk about a person being a ritually proper person, which for them is sort of real synonymous with kind of a classy person, right? A person who you can respect. I think that the whole idea of civilization for Confucius involved the idea of a communicative space. And this is another thing that Socrates is always talking about. People need to be civil or you just can't do it. You can't talk about ideas if someone's already not polite. For Confucius, performing these rituals was what created that space, was what set that tone where then we would deal with each other in a civilized manner. Civilization, a process, right? The process of becoming civilized. Civilization, not just the noun, but civilization, the process, the verb. Okay. Now, here's a real central idea about individuality. I'll go through it. In hunter-gathering society, you just don't have that much that's going to differentiate one person from another. You've got the men and the women, you've got the adults and the children. Maybe there's a head man or something like that, some person like that. Maybe there's the old people. But, the point is that there are very few groups, there's very little that distinguishes one person from another. I think it's hard for us in our incredibly variegated and stratified culture and society to even imagine what it would be like to live in a place where you really didn't have a lot that was going to cause you to think, well, I'm different from this person right next to me. Paradoxically, it's big societies. In a modern classroom where there's 30 people in there, even in a place that's regional, a lot of those people come from the same place, even then, nowadays you're going to have variation in religions, all kinds of variations in experience, variations in other kinds of identities acquired and inherited that are really everyone in our society of billions of people interconnected has a very, very highly refined sense of their individuality and their uniqueness and their difference from other people. And that's sort of what makes you free. Remember, I said that freedom depends on you actually being someone. In order to be someone who can be free, you have to be substantial. You have to have your own reasons, your own pros and cons. That's what makes it your act. That's a necessary condition for the possibility of freedom, if you will. So again, contrary, say, to the early 19th century romantics, like the romantic poets or people like that, contrary to that, I mean, very conservative vision of Confucius is that what makes you the kind of person who can say about yourself that you are free and creative and so on is precisely the texture and depth and breadth of the social matrix in which you are a node. I mean, that actually is the thing that's making you sort of interesting and free. So, and the last bullet point there, I say again, Confucius, a man who grew up in a time of civil war and great violence, a man who grew up fatherless and low status. He saw civilization in that verb sense, right? To civilize, the creation of people, taming humans and making them into people and making them into someone. Also remember about classical thought that the fancy word is soteriological, but it's about, we say, living the good life. It's supposed to change your life. I mean, lots of philosophical texts you might come by today are sort of about some topic of intellectual interest and someone has an opinion. But these classical texts are much more ambitious. I mean, they think that the reason you go to study is to change your life. So Rousseau sort of had the notion of the noble savage and that civilization was corrupting. Again, Confucius is the opposite. Confucius thinks you come out an empathetic, sensitive, moral being after you've been civilized and changed from a brute into a person. So it's a kind of collectivist humanism. It's a positive theory of human nature, but it's a positive theory of collective human nature. I also, in that second point, say it's non-Cartesian. Maybe that's a little nerdy of me to throw that in. That meaning Cartesian, mind-body dualist, inside looking out. I mean, Confucius doesn't have that added. That notion of mind-body dualism. He's got, it's more empiricist. Outward comportment constitutes ethical character. You walk the walk. Because ethics refers to social conduct. The sphere of ethics, the sphere of politics, and even the sphere of individuality itself, noticed on this analysis, all are things that happen in the social sphere, in the social realm. They are intersubjective things. Ethics is intersubjective. Psychology, for Confucius, intersubjective. So then, third bullet point, altruism, etiquette, and filial piety. There is the family really is more important to Confucius ultimately, I think, than the state. And that's part of the reason why, I think that's also another reason why from time to time, Confucianism goes out of style with the authorities, because you can go too far. In Hobbes, when the state can't guarantee your life anymore, you no longer have any obligations to it. In Confucius, the idea is more like when the state is no longer respecting your family and your filial duties as a son or a daughter of a family, at that point, the state is no longer has a legitimate role in your life. And he talks about these relationships. Now, and I'm going to rewrite them in a non-masculinist thing because I'm so PC. But look, it's not that if you want to be a good person, these are the relationships where you have to perform the proper rituals and have the proper ritualistic attitude and take it seriously. It's not just that. It's deeper than that. It's not just a prescription like that. It's an analysis. Like I say, Confucius gives us a social theory. He says that being in these relationships is what makes you a person. Growing up in a family with caregivers and siblings and later children, that's what makes you a person. It makes you a person. It's not something you ought to do if you want to be a good one. It's something you need to do if you want to be one at all. So ritual propriety then is, I use the word there, existential. I mean, it's making you a person. Being in these relationships and maintaining these relationships properly is just what being a person is. That's the idea. Now, this is as technical as I'm going to get. Confucius gives us the golden rule. It's in the Analects. It's practically word for word. It really is just practically, quote, only treat other people the way you would want them to treat you, unquote, or something like that. It's just the golden rule, which we find in many places. We find it in Christianity, New Testament. Famously, we find it in Kant. In Kant, he says, well, you have to universalize. You have to ask yourself whether any rational being could do the thing you're considering doing. And that's the way that you put yourself in a logical situation where you can decide whether it's logically defensible or not that you do that. That's Kant's rationalist, logic-based, cognitivist ethics. Confucius does universalize, but not for the same motives and not in the same way. Confucius, remember, says that you being in your social role and your social station is what defines me and allows me and makes me possible, makes it possible for me to be in my social role, my situation. So in as much as we're functional members of society, to that extent, we have moral and legal sort of roles and rights and responsibilities. So when he says it, look, it's like John Rawls, right? It's like if you were in this situation of this other person, the person you confront, whether they're sort of socioeconomically sort of above you or below you or whatever it is. But if you were in their situation, you would want to be treated the way someone in that situation should be treated. That's Confucius's version. Maybe there you see a little dark side of Confucius. And there's no doubt about it, Confucius is a defender of the status quo, just like Aristotle, because just like Aristotle, he thinks he's looking at a naturally occurring sort of structure that's just sort of there. And then the last bullet point, another point, I mean, and I'm not stressing that here because, again, I'm stressing the social confusion. Confucius isn't very interested in metaphysics, frankly. But Asian thinking in general is certainly characterized by a greater stress on unity, kind of oneness of all things. That's a kind of formula, that's a general metaphysical formula that's taken to be a lot more primary in a lot of Asian philosophy than European philosophy. Obviously, that ties into this Asian social thinking that we're looking at and trying to understand today. Oh, okay, so that's that. All righty then. Yeah. Step out of that. Okay, so then just a very brief introduction to Confucius. A lot that's positive. I mean, the vision is very generous one. And again, similar, I think, to some Mahayana thought in the sense that you really want to see that it's the welfare of every individual in the collective is really ultimately what you should care about. Of course, Christianity tells us that too, right? So, and yet, there's a dark side to it too. I mean, I don't want to, I think it's important to understand Confucius for his own sake, but I do think that ultimately you get kind of an emphasis maybe on a membership in an ethnic collective or something like that, which is maybe not as salutary. Maybe this is Middle Kingdom thinking that's not so great for dealing with the rest of the world. But who am I to say such a thing? Our point is just to try to understand Confucius. Again, what's the takeaway? Confucius is essentially a social theorist. The theory that he gives us is that the collective society really is primary and is the source and the foundation of the individual. So the collective really is the thing that needs to come first, and that a civilized person has the welfare of the whole collective in mind and understands that their adherence to tradition and respect and understanding of the system and the structure of the society is part of what a good citizen does. Well, all right, sure, of course, intellectual responsibilities. But anyway, again, the sum up though is that you see, where do we see this sort of collectivist emphasis on collectivist political behavior come from? Certainly one of the biggest sources is Confucius. And then when we look at modern day political structures, we can go back in history and see the similarities between those and older political structures among the same people in the same place. All right, bye-bye.